On screen, a grainy, desaturated close-up of a man hanging from a loblolly pine. His mouth is curled upward with a broken, unnatural calm. His eyes are open, staring, pointing toward something unseen in the forest. Narrator: deep, grave pit between 1836 and 1841, in the dense woods of Halley County, Alabama. 52 slave catchers vanished. Some were found days later, some months, and some were never found at all. Their deaths were blamed on wolves, on raiders, on storms, but every local family, every church, every orphanage whispered the same name: Ezekiel Cross. Cut to a shaky historical illustration of plantation owners gathered around a map. Ezekiel wasn't a ghost story, it was real. A runaway enslaved man whose fury became the marrow of southern legend, a man said to move through trees without sound, a man who carved messages no one alive could decipher, a man whose body was never recovered. Thunder rolls, camera pans over an abandoned seminary hidden in woods. Tonight we reopen the case buried under a century of silence. Tonight, we uncover the secret Alabama spent generations trying to forget, what really happened in those woods, and why the churches still refuse to speak his name. The town of Coldwater Bend doesn't appear on most modern maps. A handful of derelict houses, a boarded church, a former orphanage collapsing beneath vines thick as rope. But according to archived census logs, Coldwater Bend was once the richest cotton parish in Alabama. Narrator: the people here knew how to build walls between slaves and masters, between truth and what must never be spoken aloud. Local folklore describes a night in 1829 when an enslaved infant was found on the church steps, wrapped in burlap, silent, with a strange, burned symbol on his chest, a circle split by a jagged vertical line. No one knew who set the child there. No mother claimed him. The pastor named him Ezekiel 4, the one who prophesies ruin when no one listens. He grew up inside the Coldwater Bend Seminary. 4 colored boys, a harsh institution for orphaned, enslaved children operated by white church elders who believed suffering created obedience. A former ledger describes him: unusually quiet, unusually observant, disturbingly patient. But the most striking detail comes from a letter written by Sister Magdalene. In 1834, the boy has a way of knowing when someone lies. He looks through you as if he's reading a second story written behind your face. The seminary children were forbidden from entering the woods, forbidden from asking about the burned symbol, forbidden from speaking Ezekiel's name after dark. Why? Because the elders already believed he wasn't just a child. They believed he was an omen. Inside the seminary, discipline was everything. Children woke at 4 a.m., marched barefoot on cold stone, when recited verses about obedience until their throats burned. Those who disobeyed were locked in the reflection room, a windowless stone cell beneath the building, lit only by a small iron vent that breathed damp air from the crawlspace. Narrator: but the punishments changed when Ezekiel grew older. They stopped hurting him, because they realized he didn't respond like the others. Documented accounts describe disturbing incidents during a whipping session. Ezekiel never cried. Instead, he watched the overseer until the man dropped the whip and vomited beside the wall. When another boy bullied him, the bully later claimed Ezekiel stood behind him in his sleep, whispering without moving his lips. Sister Magdalene confessed in a torn diary page that she once found him kneeling in the dark chapel, staring at the crucifix with an expression she could not name, something between hunger and recognition. At night, the other children heard noises under the floorboards beneath Ezekiel's bed, scratching, breathing, whispers repeating the burned symbol's name, the split circle. One child drew the symbol on a slate, and we claimed it meant something waiting under the trees. But the most chilling testimony came from the seminary's cook. That boy ain't alone, she whispered. He came here with something already tied to him, something that wants to finish what it started. In winter 1835, a young overseer named Benjamin Harrow went missing. At the time, Harrow was known for his cruelty, especially toward orphan boys. Several children later testified that Harrow targeted Ezekiel specifically, determined to break the demon out of him. One night, Harrow dragged Ezekiel toward the woods by the collar. Witnesses recall Ezekiel standing limp, unresisting, staring at Harrow with the same expression the hanged catchers would wear years later: calm, almost knowing. Harrow never returned. Searchers found only his hat and his open Bible, pages shredded as if clawed by an animal. But the trees around the site were carved with a split circle symbol, dozens of them etched deep into living bark. The seminary elders silenced the incident, claiming Harrow ran off during the night, but the children refused to walk past the chapel after dark. One boy whispered Ezekiel didn't kill him, the woods took him. Another said Ezekiel was in 2 places at once that night, sitting calmly in the dining hall even as someone saw his shadow walking among the trees. Narrator: this was the first disappearance, but not the last. And with every vanished man, the seminary tightened its grip on Ezekiel, not to protect others from him, but to protect others from what followed him. By 1836, Ezekiel was 17, silent, watchful, marked. The seminary elders claimed he was possessed by rebellion. Plantation owners demanded he be sold or executed, but the church insisted he remain white, because they feared the symbol. On July 18, 1836, The seminary caught fire. Survivors recall waking to screams and blistering heat. Flames crawled across the rafters like living veins. Doors jammed. Windows cracked from inside, as if pushed outward by invisible hands. When the smoke cleared, 21 children lay dead. Ezekiel was gone. Witnesses saw him walking calmly into the burning woods, barefoot, the split circle glowing faintly on his chest as if reburned. Slave catchers were dispatched immediately. Narrator. But here the story fractures, because the first group sent after him never made it back. Their bodies were found days later, hanging from separate trees miles apart, each with a carved message across their torsos. You follow what does not want you. This was a night Ezekiel Cross became a legend, a fugitive, a hunter of hunters, a vessel of something older than the town itself, Coldwater. Bend would never recover after the first bodies were found hanging like warnings. The plantation cartel that controlled Hale County convened in secret. 21 plantations, 47 overseers, 52 armed slave catchers they called themselves. The Redemption Brigade. Narrator. They believed they were restoring order. They believed Ezekiel was just a man. They were wrong. The brigade divided into 7 teams, each assigned a quadrant of the woods. They carried mastiff dogs, iron chains, torches, and rifles blessed by the parish minister. The night they entered the forest, every dog refused to cross the tree line. Every single one. Handlers dragged them, beat them, screamed scripture into their ears. The animals only howled and backed away, teeth bared toward the black trees. By dawn, the dogs were gone, not dead, not taken, just vanished. Inside the forest, men whispered that the air itself felt heavier. Sound moved strangely. Sometimes voices echoed before they were spoken. Sometimes footsteps continued even after the walker stopped, and always somewhere, deeper, the faint scraping of something carving into bark. When the first team disappeared, the others still believed Ezekiel was human. When the second team vanished, they blamed Seminole raiders. When the third team found the hanging bodies of the seconds, pointing toward the heart of the forest, they finally understood. No one was hunting Ezekiel anymore. They were being led. Hidden in the basement archives of the Coldwater Bend Church lies a document sealed until 1901, a confession handwritten by Pastor Abram Tolland, the man who oversaw Ezekiel's upbringing. It was labeled, "Do not open, contains blasphemy." Inside, Tolland recounts the night Ezekiel arrived at the seminary. Not placed, not abandoned, deposited. A knock at the chapel door woke him just before dawn. When he opened it, there was no adult, no mother, no wagon, only a swaddled newborn lying perfectly centered on the top step. The burlap was warm, but the stone beneath it was ice cold. Pastor Tolland wrote, "The child did not cry. The child did not blink. The child stared into me, measuring something it had no right to understand." But the most chilling detail came next. Under the infant's back, pressed into the stone, the pastor found a seared imprint, the split circle symbol, burned into the rock itself, still smoking. He touched it and suffered blisters for weeks. He also admitted something else. The elders didn't keep Ezekiel out of mercy. They kept him because the night he arrived, the church bells rang by themselves, not an alarm, but in a slow, deliberate rhythm, a pattern, the same pattern carved into the trees where the first catchers were hanged. Narrator. This confession was hidden for 70 years, not to protect Ezekiel's name, but to protect the church from the truth of what it invited into its walls. The woods around Coldwater Bend were ordinary to outsiders: pine, ash, willow, swamp oak, but locals believed something older lived beneath them. Plantation wives forbade children from gathering firewood after dusk. Field workers claimed they heard voices under the soil, humming like distant drums. Native Choctaw elders refused to enter the area entirely. One elder, Chula Hajo, warned, "That ground remembers blood. It remembers what the white men buried there and tried to forget." Archaeological surveys from the 1920s unearthed strange findings: ceremonial pits, bone dust mixed with ash, stones marked with inverted spirals. The surveyors quit after discovering a mass grave of unidentifiable remains, skulls carved with a split circle. But in the 1830s, slave catchers knew nothing of this history. They only knew the trees seemed to shift positions, landmarks disappeared, trails curved back on themselves, torches extinguished without wind. One survivor claimed the forest inhaled branches rising and falling like a sleeping chest. Another whispered that the trees tilted their heads as they passed. Narrator. Whether hallucination or haunting, every man who entered those woods described the same sensation, the feeling of being studied. By the third day, 7 men had gone missing without sound. The remaining 45 realized they weren't searching for Ezekiel. They were walking deeper into something with memory, appetite, and purpose, something that had been waiting for a child with a burned symbol on his chest to return. On the 4th morning, the Redemption Brigade found a clearing. In the center stood 3 men from the first disappeared team, alive, kneeling, heads bowed. At first, they seemed unharmed. Then one man lifted his face. His eyes had been removed cleanly without blood. Another man's tongue was missing, carved out so precisely that the wound was already closing. The third had both hands severed but no sign of struggle, no signs of dragging. Pinned to their chests were bark strips carved with a message, "Look away." Before the men could be rescued, they turned their heads toward the deeper forest and spoke in unison, voices perfectly synchronized. "He is not running. He is becoming." They died seconds later, spines contorting, rib cages cracking, one by one as if crushed by invisible weight. The brigade tried to flee. They became lost instantly. Compass needles spun. Horses bucked and ran. The sky itself dimmed as though the sun were filtered through water. Narrator. By the end of that day, 16 more men were dead, not from wounds, but from terror. Their hearts simply stopped. Their bodies were found kneeling just like the 3 in the clearing, as though bowing to something behind them, behind the trees, behind the air, behind Ezekiel. Only one civilian ever saw Ezekiel after his escape and lived long enough to speak of it, a midwife named Mercy Walthrop. She found him at dusk near the riverbank, shirt torn, bare feet caked in mud and soot. The split circle on his chest glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. But what terrified her wasn't Ezekiel. It was the figure standing behind him. She never described it fully, only said it was tall enough to bend the sky and thin enough to hide in a shadow. It made no footsteps, no breathing, but she felt its presence moving through her body like cold water. She collapsed. When she woke at dawn, Ezekiel was gone, but her hands were covered in symbols, split circles drawn in black ash. The message he left behind: "Do not send them. The forest will keep what the church tried to bury." For decades, Mercy refused to speak further, but before her death, she recorded one final statement. Ezekiel wasn't hunting them. He was guiding something older, something that woke when he did. Narrator. If Mercy's testimony is true, then the Redemption Brigade never had a chance. They weren't hunting a runaway man. They were invading an ancient covenant. In 1888, a historian named Josiah Clark proposed the unthinkable. Ezekiel was not the first child marked by the split circle. He uncovered burial mounds dating back centuries, children's bones arranged in geometric patterns. Each skull bore the same carved symbol. Clark's notes describe a secretive pre-colonial sect known among the Choctaw as the believed to be chosen infants infused with the spirit of the forest, not possessed, not demonic, but awakened. The sect believed certain children inherited memories, not their own ancestral trauma stored like dormant lightning. When triggered, these memories found form. Clark concluded Ezekiel was one such child, planted at the church intentionally, not by a mother, but by a lineage the church tried to erase. His final annotation reads, "A church that fears a single child fears the history that child carries." Weeks after writing this, Clark vanished during an expedition in Hale County. His boots were found neatly placed at the base of a pine. His notebook lay open beside them. Only one sentence had been added at the bottom of the page: "He is remembering." By the 6th day, the Redemption Brigade was down to 18 men. They didn't speak to each other anymore. They didn't eat. They barely slept. They just kept walking, driven by the sound of rhythmic knocking echoing from deep inside the forest. No one could determine the source. Some said it came from the trees. Others said it came from beneath the ground. One man insisted it came from inside his own skull. A diary found later describes the moment when the oak canopy above them began to shiver, though no wind blew. Then the trees started to bleed. Sap poured like dark syrup, but its smell wasn't sweet. It smelled like copper. Men broke ranks, sprinting blindly. 3 were swallowed by a sudden sinkhole, gone without scream or trace. Another shot himself rather than continue. The remaining few soon realized they were walking toward a landmark they had seen before, again and again and again. Narrator. The forest wasn't just shifting. It was shaping them, herding them, preparing them. Before the last men disappeared, they reported seeing Ezekiel standing at the edge of a ravine. His eyes were no longer brown. They were as black and reflective as river water at midnight. Then he spoke, not with anger, not with triumph, but with grief. "You should have let me burn." Only one journal survived the final night, that of Overseer Malachi Stroud. His last entries are shaky, slanted, written as though by a trembling hand. "He is everywhere. He moves between the trees like a thought. We cannot see the thing behind him, but it sees us." Stroud claims Ezekiel no longer walked. He glided, leaving no prints, no broken branches. He moved with the forest. When the catchers tried to shoot him, rifles jammed. When they tried to corner him, the ground softened under their boots as though rejecting them. The final entry is splattered with mud and what appears to be dried blood. It reads, "He isn't killing us, he's returning us. We were already dead. The trees remember." This journal was found tied around Stroud's neck. His body posed upright, wedged between 2 twisted pines as if pressed into their trunks by massive hands, his face smiling, pointing toward the old seminary ruins. After the brigade vanished, a militia was sent to investigate the seminary. They found the building half collapsed, charred beams forming a ribcage shape against the sky. Soot covered the floors. The reflection room was sealed shut from the inside. When they pried it open, They discovered dozens of child-sized handprints covering the stone walls, pressed so deeply they left permanent impressions. The prints were not burned, not carved, pressed as if the stone had softened under their touch. In the center of the room sat a crude altar covered in ash. Embedded in the ash was something that made even hardened soldiers refuse to record detail, a mass of fused teeth, too many to belong to one child. Narrator. If this was Ezekiel's beginning, then the forest was his inheritance. On the far wall of the reflection room, one final inscription was carved: "Return what you took." The militiamen fled the site before dusk. By morning, the reflection room had collapsed, entirely swallowed by earth. As if the forest itself wanted the evidence back. In the years after Ezekiel's disappearance, strange phenomena plagued the area. Children in the nearby town claimed to see a quiet man watching from the tree lines, tall, expressionless, sometimes with glowing lines across his chest. Parents dismissed the stories until 3 children went missing during an autumn festival. Their footprints led toward the woods and simply stopped. Days later they returned, dirty, silent, unharmed but changed. All 3 had the split circle drawn on their palms in charcoal. None remembered where they had been. One child later whispered, "He showed us where the bad men sleep." Another said, "He said we were his brothers." The third refused to speak, but spent nights carving trees behind his house. Always the same circle, always the same vertical split. Narrator. It appeared the forest had chosen more than one heir. By 1841, Coldwater Bend church leaders recognized the truth. The story of Ezekiel Cross could not be contained. Rumors spread of plantations collapsing, families fleeing the region overnight, orphanages suddenly shuttered. Parish elders met behind locked doors. Their conclusion: erase it. Erase Ezekiel. Erase the seminary. Erase the Redemption Brigade. They altered census records, burned ledgers, rewrote events as accidental deaths and slave uprisings. Anyone who spoke of the forest publicly was excommunicated. One surviving letter from the church archivist states, "We do not fear the boy. We fear what will happen if people learn what he became." Choctaw tribes were paid to avoid discussing the area. Surveyors were bribed to mark the region as unstable ground. The county boundaries were redrawn to exclude the most dangerous sections of the forest entirely. By 1852, Ezekiel Cross officially ceased to exist, but the bodies did not stop appearing over the next 5 decades. 1850s through early 1900s, loggers and surveyors occasionally went missing near the old Coldwater Bend woods. Most were never found, but some were discovered hanging in trees, always in the same posture, smiling, eyes open, finger pointing deeper into the woods. Autopsies showed no signs of struggle. No broken bones, no ligature damage. It was as though they had agreed to it. Pinned to one body in 1879 was a new message carved into oak bark: "The forest remembers its children." Locals avoided the area entirely. Still, the church maintained silence. Maintaining their narrative mattered more than the truth. Narrator. By then, Ezekiel had become something between a warning and a prophecy. Not a man, not a myth, a cycle. The last confirmed sighting of Ezekiel occurred in 1903, witnessed by a railroad engineer named Solomon Pike. He was working near an unfinished rail line, close to the old seminary, when he saw a figure standing between 2 pines, tall, barefoot, shirtless. The split circle glowed like embers on the man's chest. Pike called out in fear. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It simply watched him. Then, without sound, it stepped backward into a tree, its body dissolving into the bark as though the wood opened like water. Pike quit his job the next day and never returned to Alabama. He told reporters that was no ghost, that was no spirit, that was something this land created because we refused to face what we did. In 1948, a locked box labeled Cross, Ezekiel, Restricted was discovered in a courthouse basement during renovations. Inside were fragments of Stroud's bloody journal, Mercy Walthrop's testimony, the pastor's confession, sketches of the split circle from multiple decades, and a final note: "If the forest wakes again, do not intervene. Do not hunt the child. Do not enter the trees." Attached was a map showing 52 marked locations, XHE. The site where a slave catcher was found hanging. In the center of the map was the seminary, and beneath the seminary, written in the archivist's trembling hand, "He waits where they made him." We end where the story began, in the ruins of a forgotten institution, in a forest shaped by blood and silence, in the shadow of a child who never had a chance to be human. The truth, buried for more than a century: Ezekiel Cross did not murder 52 men. The forest did. Ezekiel was its voice, its memory, its retribution. The church feared him because he unveiled what they tried to hide. The land itself carried the weight of enslaved children, stolen futures, and unmarked graves. When Ezekiel burned, the forest woke. When they hunted him, the forest answered. When they buried the truth, the forest preserved it, and it still does. As the camera zooms out over the abandoned woods, wind presses the trees into a slow, deliberate bow. For just a moment, their shapes resemble something like a figure, tall, thin, watching. Some histories do not stay buried. Some wounds grow roots. and some names whispered or forbidden become the only justice left behind. Fade to black.